We are talking to Charles Pellegrino, the author of To Hell and Back, The Last Train from Hiroshima. Thank you very much for your time, and we're looking forward to hear more about your book and you as well. Would you tell us a little bit more about, obviously everybody knows a little bit about the topic, but what really happened and what the book focuses on during the two bombing nuclear explosions that happened in Japan several decades ago now?
Well, the Nagasaki bomb was more than twice as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. And in fact, most of the photos that some people might be familiar with that they've seen are actually of the town upriver of Nagasaki, or Akami, and not Nagasaki itself. It was, the results were much more horrifying. The injuries to the people even very far away were much worse. For example, in Hiroshima, trees facing Hiroshima had some flash desiccation of the leaves, drying out of the leaves during the days afterward as a result of the flash, out to a radius of only about 12 kilometers. For Nagasaki, it was out to a radius of 80 kilometers, which is about 50 miles. If you can imagine a dry period in the northwestern U.S., that would have created a hurricane of fire 100 miles across, those kinds of flash effects during a dry season. The bombs were actually much worse than most people imagine, and Nagasaki, under General MacArthur, under the occupation, he did everything in his power to make sure that Nagasaki became the forgotten atomic bomb. So what I had been thinking over many years was of the way to connect the two cities and tell the story of both cities and tell the story about the forgotten bomb was through this very rare group of people who had survived Hiroshima, most of whom worked for Mitsubishi Corporation, and who were taken aboard two trains to Nagasaki. There were about 300 of them. 90% of them were killed in the second atomic bombing, but there were almost 30 people who actually did survive both atomic bombs, one of whom I came to know personally and who became one of my great teachers.
Very fascinating. Would you care to describe a little bit, if you take us back in history and in time, that what really happened in those two cities, how far apart they are, a little bit of geography lesson, what were the objectives of the American bombings, and how the events unfolded on that day or on those days when it happened?
Well, during the spring of 1945, we had Tinian Island. We had these islands that were bases that we had captured off the coast of Japan at great cost to capture these islands, Iwo Tinian Island, and so on. And then we had air bases from which we were sending fire bombings into Japan. There was actually a fire bombing of more than a third of Tokyo, intentionally just to leave the Imperial Palace intact so that they could surrender. But the firebombing of Tokyo, not counting the radiation effects that Hiroshima and Nagasaki had, over the course of 2 days, it had taken more lives than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. There were approximately 60 cities that were firebombed almost completely out of existence in Japan. And in July of 1945, the atomic bomb had become available. Another thing that most people do not know is after one was tested at Alamogordo in the desert to see that the atomic bomb really would work, we were down to only 2 atomic bombs. So in the end, under President Truman, it was somewhat a game of poker that he promised that we had more atomic bombs and we would keep dropping these atomic bombs on the cities of Japan. And what had already happened in Japan was scary enough to some in the Imperial Palace. 60 cities had all but disappeared. And then on top of these fire bombings came the 2 atomic bombs. And at first the warlords did not believe that Hiroshima had been an atomic bomb, even after Dr. Nishino, one of the Japanese atomic scientists, looked at Hiroshima, came back with radioactive debris and said, there is no defense against this type of weapon. And but after Nagasaki, we had no atomic bombs left in the arsenal. And Nagasaki was on August 9th. On August 14th, we sent in a 3,000 plane firebombing raid. We were down to bombing just small towns, or rather large towns, by August 14th. And that broke the whole... there was also a revolution in the imperial palace. For a while, the emperor, who wanted to surrender, and had recorded 2 phonograph record speeches of the surrender, was actually being held prisoner in the imperial palace. That's how insanely dedicated the warlords were. If they were going to die, they wanted all of the Japanese people to die with them. And there was an impasse, and some people on the emperor's side broke that. And it was actually the massive firebombing of August 14th that allowed the breaking of that revolution in the palace, and the radio broadcast was allowed on August 15th, which was 6 days after Nagasaki. And most of the Americans viewed the atomic bomb who were involved in the decision as one more type of firebombing in the tool package. We were dropping every experimental item that could be thought of on the existence, which was Japan at that time. We even had a bomb that was designed to drop and open up and let thousands of bats, each of them equipped with a little incendiary device, fly into wooden structures in Japan and create massive firestorms.
Wow. So what has happened since then? Because obviously 60 years have gone by, and longer than that, and almost 70 years. And since, what have been the long-term impact on the people, on the country, and on the region as well there?
Well, there is still some residual radiation under the mud in the rivers and on river deltas of both cities. What saved Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that both of these cities were prone to tremendous rain downfalls, cyclones, what we call hurricanes here. And in fact, in September of 1945, both cities were hit by a terrific storm that washed most of the radiation out to sea. And there was one physician in Nagasaki who was also a scientist, and he was recording biologically what happened. And before the storm struck, he recorded how actually there were 2 of them. There was Dr. Nagai and Dr. Akazuki, and they recorded at what was left of their hospital outpost on a hill overlooking Nagasaki and Orakami, how people who were camped out lower down, it was as if there was this tide of something invisible that was rising and killing them and approaching the hospital. And on the day of the storm, they had estimated that the death zone was within about 150 feet downhill of the hospital, where people were just getting sick and dying, all of them from radiation sickness. And then this terrific storm struck, and both doctors came through it the next day feeling that the air itself had somehow changed, and that and they did notice that people stopped getting sick at that time. And there was a night where there was an estimated 12 inches of rain that fell and washed most of the radiation out to sea. But to this day, eating shellfish, or at least large quantities of shellfish from the region, would be in the range of risky.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that, are there certain common things that these people are suffering? So a lot of time has passed, but I'm sure there are some long-term effects that these survivors have that are in common.
Yeah, there are several things. One thing I noticed is that I was involved in all 3 Titanic expedition groups, And so it was around shortly after Bob Ballard discovered the Titanic in 1985, and approximately the same amount of time had passed. And I noticed that with the exception of one woman, every one of the Titanic survivors who was available in the 1980s to be interviewed and contribute details that could be used in books, they had been young children at the time the Titanic sank. It's an inverted pyramid with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Radiation affects the bones and cells of young growing bodies and rapidly dividing cells, and so people would develop cancer early in life if they were children under about the age of 14 at the time of the atomic bombings. Of the people who are available to be interviewed today, most of them were adolescent or older at the time of the atomic bombings. Almost all of those who were under the age of 12 are either now fighting cancer or they have passed. And in fact, I only know one very young Hiroshima survivor who is not right now, who was a young child at the time, who is not right now fighting cancer. And this is something we have to consider in a world that is moving more and more toward a higher probability of someone using nuclear weapons. For example, if India and Pakistan ever start throwing atomic bombs at each other.
So the damages and long-term impact on people and the cause of, or rather the extent of horror, was far more extreme or deeper than most people understand or realize.
Yes, and many parents, because they were past adolescence, their bodies were fully grown, many parents saw their children die of the effects of the radiation. Most parents who were near Hiroshima and Nagasaki lived to see that happen. One family I've come to know, the Ito family, not only did the mother live to see one brother die from the effects of radiation from Hiroshima, but grew up to see her grandson die in the South Tower on 9/11. And as soon as she accepted that the child was not just missing but had died in the attacks, then she passed also. It's the same thing happened in my family, where once my aunt had accepted that her daughter was not just missing in the North Tower, but about a month later accepted, and then we all accepted that she was gone. Very shortly after that, my aunt passed as well. So radiation released from atomic bombs or reactor meltdowns around the world, it impacts children more than adults.
And all these young lives were permanently altered, but the people who suffered the early death, or were they all dying because of the cancer, or there were other related ailments that you also discovered?
There were other related ailments. Many died early on from just the flash burns. And many people have seen pictures, and I described the whole phenomenon, the shadow people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where shadows of everything, clothes on lines, dogs walking by, pieces of equipment, trees, their shadows were on walls, and then occasionally people. Their shadows were on walls, on the steps of buildings. Most people, the mythology about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that it was very fast. It was somewhat like an antiseptic weapon. People's shadows were on walls, and those people themselves had instantly and painlessly disappeared. That only happened in a region very close to the bombs, where people were instantly carbonized and disappeared. Many, in fact, most of the people who left shadows on walls or on fields of grass, they actually lived and for a little while, and most of them lived with severe carbonization burns on one side of their body. And there's one case, the Matsuda boy, where He was shielded by plants in his aunt's garden, by a hat he had been wearing. Unfortunately, he had been very close to a zone where he received a lot of prompt radiation dose, the radiation that comes directly from the bomb itself, the gamma rays, the spray of neutrons goes right through you, tears your DNA apart, turns parts of your DNA into something much like scrambled eggs. And the boy walked out of there with very few burns on his body. I actually got to know two of the nurses that treated him and his mother, and it was the radiation dose that killed him. Even though the flash burns on his body were on less than 30% of his body, and he should have lived from the burns, the radiation weakened his immune system to such point that he died within 6 days. And when his mother went back to the home where the firestorms had taken over after the child walked away, seemingly far less injured and spared by a miracle in a zone where almost everyone else had died instantly, his mother found the child's marbles had been melted. And those marbles are actually in a museum now for the nurses of Hiroshima. So it's the child himself, he happened to be in one of those odd spaces that occur during all explosive events. A wall was pointed in just the right direction so that the forces of the explosion went around him, and he was mostly shadow shielded by plants in a garden, so he did not suffer very many physical burns. So he was shadow shielded and shock cocooned.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Between the two explosions, how many people actually lost their lives?
It's estimated, we'll never know because actual registries of people in both cities, they burned with the cities. It's approximately 200,000 people, possibly when you look at radiation-related deaths over the years afterward, massively increased rates of leukemia in children, thyroid cancer in children. It was probably over 200,000 people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's probably one of the single largest, probably the incident in history of humanity that we know, that many people died from a single incident, or there have...
From Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the scientists themselves who designed the bombs were actually surprised by the extent of the radiation effects and had not really expected the flash effects where people were severely burned on one side of their bodies. There were actually a couple of the shadow people who were flash burned on one side of their bodies who are actually still alive today. And Setsuko Thurlow being one of those people, she was one of the people that actually the co-pilot of the Enola Gay, Robert Lewis, he actually got together during the 1950s with a famous physician and author and helped to raise money to have plastic surgery for some of these very young girls. And Setsuko Thurlow is one of those and still alive today. And she's one of the people who actually left a shadow on the ground.
Mm-hmm. I want to touch a little bit on this double survivorship thing that has happened, where you talk about, where one father tells his daughter that aren't we lucky that we're in Nagasaki, and of course that we'll be safer there, and then of course things change. And you went through a lot of extensive interviewing people and finding them and documenting that and researching it. Would you explain a little bit what was going on in their minds at that time?
Yamaguchi, for example, he was an engineer, and he had survived in Hiroshima. In fact, he's one of only two people we know of who was within the fringe of ground zero both times. And he survived Hiroshima, and he knew that this was a new kind of weapon, that it was only one bomb. There were actually several people who knew it was an atomic bomb. It was actually less of a secret in Japan because the Japanese scientist, Dr. Nishina being one of them, he had concluded that it would take another 20 or 30 years or more to produce enough uranium-235 or enough plutonium to make an atomic bomb. So it wasn't as certain a thing in Japan, so the idea of the atomic bomb was not that much of a secret. So people like Dr. Paul Nagai of Nagasaki, Dr. Haichiya in Hiroshima, they both knew the bomb was atomic. And they both knew a lot about how it would work. They even had ideas from people they knew that a hydrogen bomb could be built. And so one of the double survivors, Yamaguchi, he knew that this had to be one of these special bombs. He knew that Hiroshima had not had any fire bombings or anything of that sort happen to it, and he suspected that Hiroshima had been saved for something special, that airplanes could fly over and see the before and after effects, and there would be no confusion with previous fire bombings, that it was all done by one bomb. He knew of one other city that had not been bombed, and that was Nagasaki, where his wife and child lived. And he went to Nagasaki so that he could die with his wife and his child. And on the morning of the second atomic bombing, he was at the Mitsubishi offices trying to tell his boss and about 30 other people at this meeting about what this atomic bomb had done to Hiroshima, and his boss did not believe him. And he had already told everyone, if you see this bright flash outside, dive to the floor immediately. Make sure the windows are open all the way up to the top, because flying glass is a great hazard. And the other workers had opened the windows, and it just happened that they were in the only office in the building that was behind an iron and steel, concrete framed stairwell that acted almost like the prow of a ship against the shock wave. And although the rest of the building essentially disappeared, Yamaguchi and his boss and the 30 people in that office with him were among the only survivors. He had one of history's strangest moments of turning to his boss and saying, "Do you believe me now?" Which is exactly what he said.
Would you explain, readers, what went in putting the book together? Because there's a lot of work. There's also a lot of time has passed by, so creating forensic evidence sometimes could be very challenging. And how long it took you to put the book together?
On and off, I would say it was a book I was kind of putting together from the time I was in high school. Just as Walter Lord, who wrote A Night to Remember, began putting together information and interviewing survivors when he was 14 years old, and then years and years later, finally in the 1950s, wrote A Night to Remember about the Titanic. And a friend of mine in high school, whose father was in the FBI, who we didn't know exactly what he did, but he knew an awful lot about explosive events. And he had studied Hiroshima and Nagasaki, various volcanic eruptions. And he was the one who first told me that there were these people who survived both atomic bombings. And in fact, he spoke about Yamaguchi. He spoke a lot about Kenshi Hirata, who was the man in the book who was carrying the bones of his wife from Hiroshima to her parents in Nagasaki, and had been, at the time I first began researching the subject, he had been in hiding with his family since 1955. Once the newspaper had reported that this guy survived both atomic bombs and he had these two children. Now in Japan, even the children of someone who was exposed could be denied college, employment, marriage, so he was understandably in hiding. My friend who was in the FBI had been trying to find whatever happened to Kenshi Hirata. I could never find him either. In fact, when I was writing the book finally in 2008 and 2009, still not a clue as to where Kenshi Hirata was, and it was kind of presumed he had probably passed on by then. And but anyway, it was a subject where, of course, during the years in between, I ended up working with people at Brookhaven National Laboratory. I grew up during the time of the duck and cover drills and get under your table and here's what we do if there's an atomic bomb detonating. And just almost like what I was being brought up with as one of my worst fears, I ended up working with nuclear scientists and designing nuclear rockets with my colleagues that could get us to other planets and even maybe in the future cross interstellar space if our civilization survived. And so I ended up working with a number of people at NASA and Brookhaven National Laboratory, all the time finding more and more information because Brookhaven Labs had files on the medical files of people who had been exposed to radiation. And along the way, starting from the 1970s, my friend whose father had been studying these things brought me to conferences where Norman Cousins was, and James Michener, and a bunch of Jesuits, and lots of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. And I would record I would record as much of it as I could, and always phrases that even today, when I meet survivors, even though some of their stories the more you research it, the less new information comes out of it. Even to this day, someone will be talking and a lot of it will be confirming what others say. And then there's a sentence that jumps out at you, such as one who was 14 years old at the time said she saw the orchards of Hiroshima burning and the cherry wood that had been blossoming months before, the wood burning and the orchards burning, and she said it smelled like cherry pie. You can do all the science, all the excavation into the ground zero zones of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it's these human moments that make all the archaeology relevant. Morimoto West, she had kept a story to herself, and I had met her before, and only last May, for the first time, she told that her last words to her mother were not good, that as a teenager, like a typical teenager, arguing in the morning and then going off to her work detail in the morning, and she said her last words to her mother were angry words and slamming the door closed on her mother, and not knowing that their house, which was near the hypocenter of Hiroshima, that she would never see her mother again, never even find a way to bury her mother. And she said, tell everyone that one never knows what will happen, and that no one should ever leave the house without some sign of love, and never leave with mean words or slamming the door. And she said that after 70 years that this is the main lesson that she was taking and decided had to be handed down from Hiroshima.
So well said, so well said. How much of the research went on until 2010? And because I know you've been doing it for a long time, and were you able to discover any significant things after 2010 in the last 6 years or 5 years?
Oh, yes, it still goes on. In fact, a lot more since 2010, because we had some people who turned out to be spoofers that created a controversy. There were people pretending to be veterans, and they turned out not to be veterans, but they generated thousands of fake emails, frightening the publisher into thinking there were going to be hundreds or thousands of Air Force veterans protesting the publishing house. And among other things, there were people claiming that people in the book had been made up. And in Japan, a lot of people got very angry about this, especially a guy named Kenshi Hirata, who said, they can't say I didn't exist. And he came forward for the first time he and his entire family, and then we checked. We had pictures of him from Mitsubishi. We did double checks of skull structure and the photographs and everything that, yes, this is Kenshi Hirata. And the odd thing is his daughter worked for NBC and had reported on the death of Sumo Yamaguchi a few months earlier. And she was amazed not only that there were people who had survived both atomic bombs, but that one had lived only about a mile away from her. She had no idea that her father was a double atomic bomb survivor and that she had grown up with a double atomic bomb survivor in her own home. And so they all came forth. And that is when we finally got the rest of the story of his life and his family's life after he went into hiding with his family. After his wife, who died in Hiroshima, her family helped them to stay out of history's way and to stay hidden. And what came out of it also was one of the great love stories of all time. I mean, where reality goes beyond fiction sometimes. James Cameron's movie Titanic, it had this great love story in it, which turned out to be also very similar to an event that actually happened on the Titanic. But this story managed to just the story of Kenshi Hirata and Setsuko and his second wife's family just managed to be even more moving than that, which is hard to have expected to have come across.
A profound subject and has an enormous historic importance for many, many decades and centuries to come. How the two nations have reconciled with this fact in the recent past? I know there were some political attempts made by some of the congressmen and the Speaker of the House, the U.S. Speaker of the House, to go there and reconcile. Have there been any other efforts been made about this? Or?
Well, Carolyn Kennedy is the ambassador to Japan, and in fact, the grandson of Harry Truman is very involved in the back and forth with Japan. He's directly involved in the survivors. Only this past year, in the Truman Library, Masahiro Sasaki, who is the brother who survived with his sister Sadako, who later died of leukemia. The story of Sadako and the 1,000 Paper Cranes is a major story arc in this book. He and friends looking through the Truman Library actually found a letter by Harry Truman from around the time that MacArthur wanted to use the atomic bomb on North Korea. And Truman, in a few sentences, actually described now that he knew through science what the atomic bombs actually did. And he basically said that the atomic bomb, back then we were ignorant, we didn't know what it would do. But as long as he was alive, the atomic bomb would never, ever be used again for any reason whatsoever. And that letter itself brought more reconciliation between some of the families. There is, in fact, even now, Sadako was, we should back up a little bit and talk a little more about her. She started out folding 1,000 paper cranes for her wish for getting better, for health. And then the cranes started out at about the size of sparrows, and then finally she was making them smaller and smaller, folding them with sewing pins because they were harder to fold the smaller they got, putting more of her prayers and her soul, as she put it, into each one. And by the time they were down smaller than houseflies, and in fact getting smaller than gnats and mosquitoes, she had said that her wish was for omoyeri, for that people would grow, taking in what in America we kind of call the pay it forward principle, devoting your life in service of others, and that maybe some child out there who thinks that the world is all evil and hopeless, that just some random act of kindness could turn that child away from maybe in the future doing some evil. That was her hope. That was her prayer. And the outreach program, people who have seen pictures of the World Trade Center after the attacks of 9/11, all outside of St. Paul's Chapel, and there were thousands and thousands of bundles of 1,000 paper cranes. That's what the paper outreach program was about. That's why if you go to the Tribute Center near Ground Zero today, you'll see one of Sadako's paper cranes is there. Another of her paper cranes is at the Pearl Harbor Memorial. And so it's also one of the reasons when so many 9/11 family members brought this to, in 2009, remembering those that we lost in the 9/11 attacks, that it becomes a day of service to others. And for many of us who are family members and who have gotten to know Sadako's family, it became, no, we must live that way every day. And it's actually, when I found out and I saw the paper crane outreach, that was the point at which I decided the time has come for me to start putting it together to write a book after 9/11, and after meeting Masahiro Sasaki in the family room and meeting Mr. Ito, who lost his brother in Hiroshima and and lost his son on 9/11. And he had been asking me, because I was working forensic archaeology in Ground Zero, why everyone calls it Ground Zero and only I call it the crater or the pile. And I said, because there are two other Ground Zeros, and I feel that for me to call this Ground Zero would be to trivialize the other two. And he said, no, I call it Ground Zero, and I'm from Hiroshima. And he said, this is another place that represents a way that people must never die again. And so these two families of the atomic bomb really started this whole change. And they were decades ahead of most of us 9/11 family members, most of us who were working in the recovery operation in Ground Zero. Most of us at that time, myself included, were full of anger. And in the crater, over and over, there was not a day that went by that I wouldn't hear someone say, nuke them. Now, I knew what nuke them meant, and I would shake every time I heard someone say nuke them, because people didn't know what those two words meant. And that's why I had to write the book. And a friend of mine in Israel, Amnon Rosenfeld, and I think it's one of the most important reviews of the book I received, he was a very hawkish man, and who felt that as far as Israel and the atomic bomb, an old Scottish phrase, do unto the other fellows, he would do unto you and do it first. And after he read this book in its draft form for the first edition, he said he changed his mind completely, that he did not understand what atomic bombs really do to people. He had no idea. And he said now he feels that the person who really thinks of nuking someone first, who designs atomic bombs, builds them, has discovered the unforgivable sin.
Mm-mm. Sad stories. There are no winners here. Only people have lost lives, and there are many families that will suffer for many centuries to come from on both sides of the country, on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. How did you get into writing? If you would explain a little bit your background, and how have you changed your focus or enlarged your focus in the years that have gone by?
Oh boy, as someone who would become a writer or a scientist, when I was 8 or 9 years old, I was probably seen the most unlikely person in the world. Almost got left back in the 4th grade, could scarcely read at all. I was also auditory dyslexic, so I couldn't really understand what people were saying very well. And happened that I had parents who said, the things that a teacher wants to hear most when they're called in for a meeting, parents who were all about, what can I do to help? And then in the 5th grade, I had a very good teacher. In the 6th grade, I had one of those teachers that is gold. I'm still in contact with Mrs. Harris, and teachers who worked together with my parents and who saw that the kid loves science. Even if the reading is difficult, he will read it because he loves it, and will make projects for him, which in those days was breaking the rules, making special projects for different kids in the class and getting them through reading problems by working on these projects rather than sending them into the annex building or down into the basement to be taught remedial reading. And then other great teachers, because these teachers found the 4-H clubs for me, where I ended up meeting other people who were dedicated to learning and working on a kid's strengths, not just his weaknesses. And so my reading gradually got better, and I loved, in fact, I think somehow having to get over that hurdle, I ended up somehow developing more of a love for words, and certain people I read where their words were like music, say Ray Bradbury, for example, and H.G. Wells and Charles Dickens. There was a very poetic quality to the way they wrote, and I somehow came out with this love of words that maybe I would not have had if I didn't have to climb that extra hill. So from a young age, I started writing things. In college, I was starting to get published, and just went on and on, loving science, loving music, loving art. And even in my undergraduate years in college, I just kept running into these great professors. I was at a college where you had a lot of these professors who worked in multiple fields at once, all these brilliant minds at this small university who had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era. So I ended up meeting some of the most brilliant blacklisted scientists of my age, and to me it just seemed normal that you can be into music and art and science and 5 different sciences at the same time. And that, they always said, yeah, you love it all, you can do it all.
Have you worked as a scientist, or you've always been an author in the career?
Actually, more science than the writing. So I've worked with different scientific groups and brainstorming sessions. I mentioned Brookhaven National Laboratory, and we came up with all sorts of things out there, and paleo DNA research sort of. Well, it began when I was in New Zealand, and then it ended up going over to Brookhaven Labs, and we were talking about, well, what do we do if we can biomorph an ostrich into a dinosaur? What do you do with it? And this is in the 1980s, and by then we're talking about things like Dinosaur World Park, and I was by then writing things in Omni magazine, and no one seemed to be reading that except for one guy, Michael Crichton, and he was enough. So and there too, I worked with people. I mean, Jim Powell at Brookhaven was into all the different sciences, and then running into people. I always wondered where the Da Vincis of our age end up, and they ended up at places like Brookhaven and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and in Hollywood. Not many people know that James Cameron designed things like landing systems for Mars rovers and knows nuclear power and can educate himself up to a PhD level on certain types of relatives of the octopus in about 3 or 4 weeks. And so, a bunch of us just ended up, polymaths just ended up finding each other, and over the years working together. And Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, we all shared these same multiple interests. And Cameron, I still working with him on Avatar as a science advisor right now, where we get to thresh out all the science and where continents will be and what volcano will do what under certain gravity, and having a lot of fun doing all that. And he's in that near the top of that list of the 20 most brilliant minds I've ever met. And another one of them out there also makes movies. And so I guess Hollywood is where a lot of our Da Vinci's have ended up. And instead of painting pictures, today's Da Vinci's and Michelangelos are making movies that sing in 3D.
In the last decade, you've written at least 6 books. How do you pick a book topic, or what gets you going onto your next book topic or subject?
It has to be something that I just know my heart is in, and that it will teach in some way, that it can have a helpful message. I wouldn't just go out there and write an adventure novel just to have an exciting story. If I do fiction, it's got to be multi-layered characters, and it's got to be about things most people have never thought about before, like years ago my novel Dust. What happens if you pull out a couple of keystone species and it has a biological chain reaction that, say, for example, most of the world's pollinating insects are suddenly gone? And then the impact on agriculture and geopolitical and economic impact all over the world. And you'll see that a global agricultural collapse could actually trigger nuclear war. So things like that. Of course, the Titanic, which I thought I was through with after my first book on the subject, but Bob Ballard had warned me, and as you read at the end of her name, Titanic, you're not done. Anyone who allows the Titanic who goes and touches the Titanic and allows it to touch back, you're married to that ship for the rest of your life. And by the time I wrote the final book in the trilogy, Farewell Titanic, and three books after Bob Ballard said we'd both be married to that ship, and I had said, well, Bob Ballard's the only one who ever said he was through with that ship and would never go back, and really meant it. Sure enough, he went back. So I've just accepted that the Titanic is one of those things that will always be in my life, but that's also because if you look into the story, my main interest is the bioarchaeology of the Titanic, but the whole story grabs you. It's basically a Greek tragedy written by God with Shakespeare as his muse, is how the whole story of the Titanic reads once you get into it. It becomes a metaphor for our entire civilization.
Yeah. Are there any other projects that you would be...
Yeah, I'm working on about 5 different projects now at the same time. Among them, the Star Tram project with James Powell and his group from Brookhaven Labs. It's a launch system because people are having all these problems with trying to get a first stage to orbit that could deliver cargo to orbit, and then the rocket comes down, the first stage comes down and lands. But Star Tram is a magnetic rail gun, very much like the rail gun that the Navy is testing now, that Jim Powell and Gordon Danby had invented maglev a long time ago. But this can get cargo into space without a first stage rocket launch. So it can deliver cargo into space basically at the cost of global air freight of flying a package around the world once. Less than $50 a pound to orbit, which the best rockets that are on the drawing boards and being tested now would be $3,000 a pound to orbit. To build the space station took almost $120,000 for each pound that we put up there. Cheap access to space means that we can start very cheaply hauling these solar towers up into orbit, 36,000 miles up, We can also very easily put satellites up that clean the space pollution that's up there that's a danger to astronauts and spacecraft. But the main thing is with the Tesla array, which the great expense of it was always the cost of getting the materials up into space, and now we can do all that. StarTram is something we can actually start building right now, and it's far cheaper than rockets. And that is what can save the Earth's water supplies, provide the extra electricity for desalination all around the world, for agriculture. People can argue about whether or not global warming is taking place or whether humans have caused it, but there is no argument that the deserts of the world are expanding at a very rapid rate. The groundwater is being used up. We can't irrigate those expanding desert regions unless we have massive desalination within the next 20 years, and we have the technology to do that. And we're going to need that so that we can have a good standard of living for 9 billion people in 2045. Because that's where, if we don't do something now, around 2045 is when we end up running into agricultural problems all over the world. And believe it or not, we can have almost all of the world's power supplied by solar power from space. On top of that, in the next 20 years, controlled fusion might work, and the world would never have any power problems. We would be able to desalinate. We would be able to turn 1/3 of the Sahara Desert into farmland if we wanted to, because 1/3 of the Sahara is actually very fertile soil.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. It is always a pleasure to talk to you and hear your views about not only the one of the greatest tragedies of humankind, but also the new and positive things that may be coming down the line for the humanity. We have been talking to Charles Pellegrino, the author of To Hell and Back. Thank you very much for your time and your comments.
Thank you.